Previously on the Shriering.
4-year-old might say that he's a dog. Do you go out and buy dog food?
In today's installment.
In other words, a man who pursues 14-year-old girls may be a criminal, but he isn't a
pedophile.
This video, especially this video, made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi! Welcome back to this cognitive psychologist response to Abigail Shrier's Irreversible Damage. And I apologize for the length of time since the last video in the series. It's been a real thing here. If it wasn't one thing, like my chronic pain condition leading to some real-life drama that lasted for several months, it's been another, like my body's eagerness to experience side effects of things and getting my second vaccine dose and just being laid out for several days. I'm still feeling a little. But we're here, we're doing this, we're getting this video done. It has been a hot minute since we talked about this stuff, so we are currently partway through Chapter 7, The Dissidents. The first part covered Zucker, a psychologist who had a gender clinic in Ontario that got shut down when the province banned conversion therapy. Shrier's description of events mentioned a report that led to this shutdown, but that report had been removed from the original websites that hosted it. Thanks to the mighty power of the internet, and asking nicely, I was pointed to an archive of this report. A lot. By many people. So thank you all for that. We'll start the meat of the video there. But before we get there, quick refresher on the visual shorthand I use to indicate where ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm responding to the book, or integrating my thoughts with science, or whatever sort of stuff Shrier's including in her references at this point. Surprise! There's more blogs. Alright, let's get to this report. Before we begin, let's remember that this report has been pulled from CAMH's website. We basically only have an archived copy somebody grabbed before it got memory hold. Also, quick reminder that CAMH is a teaching and research hospital. This report has been gone over for confidentiality, so knowing if the same person's being talked about in multiple places is difficult. It's also a little difficult because instead of going with the US government style of thick black lines over sensitive info, someone, I'm assuming legal, highlighted the parts that needed obscured, and then the highlighted parts were whited out. In places, it can be hard to tell intentional blank areas from spaces where things have been removed. Okay, there's a lot of info we've seen in some form before. Zucker's clinic's emphasis was on getting kids comfortable with their birth sex. The team would want to get to the root of a young child's gender variance, meaning what's going on in the family. The child would be encouraged to have same birth sex friends, toy interests, and gender-appropriate hobbies. If these didn't change the gender situation for the kid for some period of time, then transition would be recommended. The report indicated that roughly 2/3 of older teens with persistent gender dysphoria were referred out for hormonal treatment. There's some new pieces of info too. Zucker would emphasize to parents worried their kids were going to turn out gay that their work wasn't to change the child's orientation. Perhaps this is part of why he's argued his work wasn't conversion therapy. CAMH's legal counsel said Zucker reaches out reactively, not proactively, from a risk management or reputational risk perspective. Community stakeholders indicated that the gender clinic's emphasis on getting kids comfortable with their birth sex went against established treatment guidelines, and many international gender identity experts identified the practices at CAMH under Zucker as unethical. They also expressed concern that this was one of the only treatment centers for youth in Ontario, and that it was training students under Zucker's framework. People from the Central Toronto Youth Service and other social workers were unhappy that a CAMH person was present during their interview, and that Zucker's clinic was doing traumatic reparative therapy and wasn't a safe space for youth. Patients, or parents of former patients invited into the review by Zucker, had mostly positive things to say. There's also one former client who is now an adult trans person who was dissatisfied with their treatment. I don't think this is the statement that was withdrawn, but I'm not 100% sure, so we'll skip the details here. The CAMH Empowerment Council recommended many levels of changes to how treatment works, including shifting the perspective to one not fixed in the gender binary. A separate youth clinic would receive referrals from CAMH. They indicated that the referred clients didn't understand why they had received the treatment they had, that they could slip through the bureaucratic cracks if a student wasn't assigned to them, and the whole process could be overwhelming and intrusive. Also, CAMH's clinic was described as too conservative in pursuing hormonal treatment. A written submission from a parent said she felt dismissed by Zucker as she wanted a more affirming approach and wasn't given community alternatives even upon request. The reviewers noted that Zucker and his clinic had been scientifically productive, and that parents, clients, and staff who believed in Zucker's work and approach were dedicated. The two major areas of concern for the reviewers were that Zucker's clinic was operating in relative isolation and it had fallen out of current best practices. Some more specifics were that play therapy was not appropriate for gender dysphoria or gender exploration, especially when kids weren't given free rein of the toys. In other words, play with toys inappropriate for their birth sex. The invasive nature of testing, like asking a 9-year-old about what made them sexually excited at their first meeting with a clinician, coupled with the number of team members typically present, made the appointments uncomfortable at best. It was also indicated by several patients that they didn't feel they could say no to what was being asked of them, from uncomfortable questions to removing their shirt in front of Zucker and other staff. The goal of making patients comfortable with their birth sex, as opposed to actual watchful waiting or affirming care, was commented on, as well as the idea that the root of the person's gender variance needed to be found as being harmful by former patients. The report called trying to get patients into the cisgender heteronormative mold as inappropriate and unethical. Total informed consent may have been violated as, for example, pictures may have been taken with cell phones without the patient's consent, then were later shown in a conference presentation. The author said they couldn't conclude that Zucker's clinic wasn't not engaging in reparative therapy, also known as conversion therapy. If parents were not supportive of hormonal treatment, the teenager wouldn't be informed about resources available to them. The delay in referral for hormonal treatment was repeatedly noted as not good, as it can lead to negative outcomes for the patient. Relatedly, the wait times to get into the clinic, in part due to the lengthy process of admittance, was something that needed improvement. Also, the isolation came up again, as when a patient aged out, they had to go through another waiting list for further treatment, despite the potential for the clinic to work with the other agencies and save that step. The report's recommendations in moving forward were to modernize the theoretical approach, not leave treatment up to the parents alone, educate parents about gender identity and expression, refer patients to endocrinologists in a more timely manner, nix the intrusive questions, focus on the child, not the family, reevaluate the necessity of the extensive psychometric testing, have a more thorough informed consent process, and improve the waitlist situation and integrate more into the other community resources. From the way this report was talked about in the BBC documentary and then it being removed, it seemed like there must have been some really damning or incendiary stuff in it, but it wasn't really all that scandalous. Asking a 9-year-old what turns them on is highly inappropriate, but I was really expecting a lot worse given Zucker's reaction to it. And this fits with the tweets from Kate Chung, who talked about her experience as a former patient. It was okay. It wasn't the best, but it wasn't terrible. The strongest this report got, in my reading of it, was that Zucker's approach was out of date and needs to be updated. He's nearing retirement, so it's a good time to do so, and they weren't not doing reparative therapy. The report hinted at, but it didn't directly say that the treatment was unethical or conversion therapy. That was sort of in the words of others, but not necessarily part of the report itself. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's continue on with the Shriering. My original plan was to read Bailey's The Man Who Would Be Queen, a book talking about the research by Zucker and Blanchard on transsexualism, so I could give extra context for what's being talked about by Shrier. But I reread this section of the book, and aside from The Man Who Would Be Queen being published and the fallout from that. She doesn't really talk about this stuff, so why put myself through it? If you aren't familiar with autogynephilia and this focus of research, I would recommend ContraPoint's video, linked in places, because we're not really going to go into depth here on that. Shrier introduces Blanchard as a research giant, with hits like the birth order of male siblings affecting the odds of same-gender attraction later in life, and a rather confusing description of his work into pedophilia.
Using phallometric testing, he was able to demonstrate that men who say they are most attracted to pubescent children differ from men who say they are most attracted to prepubescent children, and from those who say they are most attracted to physically mature persons. In other words, a man who pursues 14-year-old girls may be a criminal, but he isn't a pedophile.
With regard to the birth order and prenatal hormonal influences on sexual orientation, in researching and discussing formative components for the different parts that make up who we are, from orientation, gender identity to neurodiversity, there is understandably the concern of eugenics just lingering in the background. If we can figure out the genetics or prenatal conditions or whatever that gives rise to a certain part of variability in humanness, then it's conceivable that we could develop a test for it and screen for it and potentially drive down total diversity as a consequence. Those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. On the other hand, we're generally pretty curious about how we tick, and these topics are a component of that. Plus, looking at how other species operate demonstrates that, say, homosexual orientation isn't some perversion of nature, but a natural part of it. Swans can be gay. Generally, I like to think that we can science responsibly and not biologically engineer out non-harmful traits. But I also understand that a lot of this hinges on who exactly is in charge of what non-harmful means. So with all that being said, there has been a fair amount of research looking into potential genetic or prenatal sources of variability in orientation or gender identity. And the data are suggestive that there are some contributing factors, but it's by no means clear-cut at this point. And as the case when we're talking about group differences, it's important to keep in mind that we're talking about differences, on average. Being the youngest son of 3 boys doesn't mean that that child will be gay. He just has an increased likelihood of being gay compared to what we would expect from how many gay men there are in the general population. Okay, moving on to the quote. And be sure to take advantage of the chapter marker or the timestamp on screen to skip this next portion if you need to. In the lead up to the publication of the DSM-5, there were debates and discussion about changes that were going to be made to it, and one of the topics that was getting changed was pedophilia. Blanchard's work that Shrier is referring to in that quote appears to be something that contributed to some changes he wanted implemented. In this experiment, as described by Shrier, the change in penile blood volume in response to experimental stimuli was measured for male patients referred to CAMH for, quote, paraphilic, criminal, or otherwise problematic sexual behavior. As noted in the paper, phallometric testing can be manipulated by the person being measured so as to not appear aroused by certain materials. I mentioned this last time this technique came up in Shrier's book, but it seems like sexologists in general have moved away from literal dick measuring to functional neural imaging techniques. To save you the specifics, they found a difference between men most attracted to prepubescent, pubescent, and adults, with Blanchard's interest most focused on the difference between prepubescent and pubescent attracted men. This is then taken to indicate that the DSM needs to change its diagnostic criteria for pedophilia, either to incorporate a subtype with age, or to add in a separation for those attracted to pubescence, known as hebephilia. Adding in a distinction for the gender of attraction was also put on the table. So, to clarify Shrier's quote in case you're having trouble like me, someone attracted to a 14-year-old isn't a pedophile, but a hebephile. Shrier moves on from this pretty quickly, but I think it's worth looking at the response to this a bit, especially as she makes it seem like it just went unquestioned, which it didn't. But before we do that, I want to make some things absolutely clear. Anyone who has any form of sexual contact or relations with another person or organism who cannot give consent is doing a heinous act. anyone who puts children in sexual situations is disgusting. Grooming is disgusting. Minor attracted persons, or MAPs, are not an equivalent sexual orientation to all the others because it necessitates a minor. It's not the same. Okay. Blanchard's proposed changes to the DSM for pedophilia were not unquestioningly accepted. Some were more okay with distinctions for the target age and gender, as it carves nature at its joints. But even for people with a more positive response to Blanchard's proposal, concern was raised that one of the diagnostic criteria for pedophilia or pedohemophilic disorder was that the proposed criterion B states the person is distressed or impaired by such arousal, or the person has sought sexual stimulation on separate occasions from 3 or more pubescent or younger children, 2 if both are prepubescent, or has used child pornography for a period of 6 months or longer. As O'Donoghue explains, this leads to several potential outcomes. Unless a person with this sort of attraction, who is legitimately distressed by it, is acting on that attraction with children or engaging in other illegal activities, they don't meet the criteria for treatment. They can't get help in dealing with that attraction unless they are a criminal. Likewise, quoting the paper, why is the unit of analysis a victim? Why does it have to be multiple victims, with the number bafflingly contingent on the age of the child? Moser argued that the attraction to minors may not be a mental disorder in and of itself. It instead may be better thought of as an expression of something else, possibly a non-paraphilic psychological disorder like antisocial personality disorder or issues with impulse control. He further argued that the criminal nature of this does not then necessitate it as a psychological disorder. This thought's echoed by Green, who identified himself as having helped remove same-gender attraction from the DSM. Part of his argument was that adding attraction to pubescence would put the DSM at odds with the age of consent in many parts of the world, and in so doing is repeating the mistakes of the past by including things like same-gender attraction or masturbation as disordered behavior. This isn't to say that a full adult having sexual relations with a teenager isn't something to be concerned with, because it is. But that doesn't mean that it's a psychological disorder in some form. As said by Green, protecting people from unwanted, unwilling, or uncomprehended sexual interaction is commendable. So legislatures enact rape laws to protect older persons and age of consent laws to protect the younger. But categorizing rape as a mental disorder should not be necessary for further protection. Final thing is a note about language, after the publication of the DSM's 5th edition. Berlin draws a distinction between pedophilia and child molestation, and notes that the DSM-5 is only helping to muddy the water. Part of the diagnostic language is that the person has acted on their sexual urges in some way. This, of course, could mean that a minor was involved, but it could also mean that the person internally fantasized about minors while masturbating. As far as the diagnostic criteria are concerned, there's not a distinction between those two. But the implications for people who are horrified at their attraction and would like to change are that seeking any sort of help would put them in the same bin as people who have molested children or have engaged with child pornography. As such, they may continue in isolation and silence instead of seeking help. So, to bring this back to Schrier's introduction of Blanchard, he did stir up a bit of discussion about pedophilia, but his contributions have hardly been universally accepted. The reason Shrier is talking about Blanchard is his transsexualism typology.
Blanchard proposed dividing gender dysphoria into 2 categories: homosexual transsexualism, child onset, effeminate boys or masculine girls who would grow into gay men and women, think drag queens, and autogynephilic transsexualism, adolescent onset, heterosexual men who are aroused by the idea or image of themselves dressed as women. Think men who transition to female in their 50s and are married to women. It was his discovery of autogynephiles, a term he coined, that brought the outrage mob to his door.
You would think she could throw at least one reference from the guy I think she interviewed at some point in here, but nope. As I mentioned earlier, if you want a more complete rundown of Blanchard's typology, check out ContraPoint's autogynephilia video for that. That said, there are a couple things I want to touch on. First, for clarity, a comment about the nomenclature. The way Blanchard's typology is set up is based on what gender the AMAB individual is attracted to, with the implicit assumption that the orientation language will map onto it cleanly. So, a person who is assigned male at birth and attracted to men would therefore be a homosexual, while an AMAB person attracted to women would be heterosexual. However, Blanchard also grouped in the aces and bis in the hetero, who all got lumped into autogynephilia. Because, according to Blanchard, if you aren't attracted to men and you are trans, there is, quote, erotic arousal in association with the thought or image of oneself as a woman. Second, I don't know why I expected Shrier's helpful description for the two categories to be done with more decorum than has been present in the rest of the book, but I'm still surprised.
There's drag queens and those who surprise their wives in their 50s.
And I might be missing something, but I'm not seeing this child versus adolescent onset that Shrier included here in Blanchard's work or discussions of it. It seems to be more about when a person transitions, either early on in life or later on. And for other researchers who ask different questions, the apparent divide between the people who transition early and later in life may be more about their knowledge of the transgender and or non-binary identity and their ability to identify and live as trans or non-binary. But Shrier's description here doesn't fully make sense. Drag queens may also be trans and or non-binary, or they may not. It's not a one-to-one thing. And that doesn't even map onto Blanchard's typology. Also, this is relying on traditional gender norms and roles. There are effeminate straight cis guys and masculine straight cis women. Given how Shrier has talked about her own tomboyishness, you'd think she'd know this. Third, Shrier includes AFAB people in this discussion, but it's basically a point in the literature that this typology does not include or describe the experiences of AFAB people, cis, trans, and or NB. Because we AFABs simply don't possess the same sexual proclivities as the hot-blooded and horny AMABs. Ugh, this all seems so Freudian. Fourth, Blanchard's typology has been argued against. It's hardly accepted as fact. Especially when you take into consideration that some of Blanchard's work argues that it explains all AMAB, trans, and or non-binary people, whether they want to admit to it or not. Longtime viewers of the channel may have just had their falsifiability sense tingle, because that is absolutely flying in the face of it. If you need to argue that your participants are lying in order to keep your theory working, you need to take a long, hard look at your theory. Another issue is that Blanchard's typology entangles gender identity and sexual orientation. As we noted at the outset of the series, those are generally understood to be separate things. Then there's the idea that the autogynephile is driven and aroused by themselves as a woman, specifically having the lady bits. But if you give these autogynephilic questions to cisgender women and, surprise, most of the participants would be categorized as autogynephilic. So it seems that this isn't really capturing a subset of the AMAB population so much as possibly just how women's sexual experience works, or possibly human sexuality in general. Finally, the stories that help Blanchard formulate his typology may be tied to the culture. As trans and or non-binary identities become more understood, especially by the people who come to identify as such, the number of people who feel that autogynephilia best describes their experience may drop, possibly to zero. So yeah, Blanchard's typology, not so much. Next. The next major step was Bailey's book, The Man Who Would Be Queen, published in 2003. Described by Shrier as incredibly sympathetic towards transsexuals, noting that they wouldn't receive it as such. She had previously noted that that term was the one used in the literature at the time, but that doesn't mean that she has to keep using it. Also, if you've seen Contra's video on that book, you may be aware of the nature of that sympathy.
The Man Who Would Be Queen is filled with sentences like,
"There is no way to say this as sensitively as I would prefer, so I'll just go ahead.
Alright, you edgy fuck, let's hear it.
Most homosexual transsexuals are much better looking than most autogynephilic transsexual.
We appreciate the feedback, Bailey. We really do.
Trans activists decided the book was unfavorable to them. They calculated, and maybe correctly, that the general public could be sold a woman trapped in a man's body, but a more nuanced and realistic version of events would be harder to sell to the general public, Dr. Blanchard said, recalling the uproar. A man trapped might be sympathetic. A man aroused might seem shameful, possibly even dangerous.
The longer I look at this paragraph, the more meaning I'm seeing woven into it. According to Blanchard, the guy whose career is built partially on studying members of this community, the narrative presented by trans people was a calculated one, that they were intentionally hiding their Blanchard-theorized kink to not attract suspicion. And he's surprised by trans and or non-binary people not responding positively to this. In case you haven't been following the situation with a certain British children's magical school author, one of She Who Must Not Be Named's arguments was that allowing trans women into a woman's bathroom would create unsafe situations for cis women. This is part of gender-critical or TERF rhetoric, and I would hazard a guess that this is along the lines of the danger that Shrier's referring to here. Bailey's book was nominated for an LGBT Literature Foundation Award. This was protested, and the nomination was rescinded. Activist academics also tried to get Bailey's Northwestern University tenure revoked. Reference 8 is an article from the Archives of Sexual Behavior about the attempted cancellation of Bailey. Well, article may be misleading. The first couple pages are about the author's history and how she met Bailey, and includes that he assumed that she was a senseless postmodern beholden to political correctness. It's a lot. Like, 56 pages a lot. Going through the play-by-play of who did what, when, just no. TLDR, Bailey tells his author over dinner that he didn't not have sex with one of the research subjects, and he's still at Northwestern. The hints of turfery I noticed earlier come out to play in earnest. Shrier's reasoning for autogynephilia mattering basically boils down to whether or not cis women are safe around amab trans and or non-binary people, and the logic goes something like this. If an amab individual is attracted to themselves and sexually aroused at the thought of themselves as a woman, then presumably they would be attracted to other women, which potentially would then put women at risk in safe spaces, like bathrooms. Right, because as we all know, amab people are beholden to their lust and their carnal desires and cannot control themselves. That was sarcasm. I know my delivery can sometimes go a bit too dry, so to avoid any confusion, that was sarcasm. It's just that that is such an absurd claim, and in certain circles, it's a popular one, possibly born out of personal experience and trauma. And I don't want to erase or invalidate anybody's experience here, but that needs to be balanced against respect and consideration of others who haven't done anything to you. Requiring trans and or non-binary people to use the bathroom assigned at birth puts them in a far more dangerous situation than for cis people sharing the bathroom with those same individuals. For more on this cheery topic, I would recommend ContraPoint's video on Rowling or Lindsay Ellis's video on the roots of pop culture transphobia. Continuing on.
Nevertheless, it is hard to deny that autogynephiles exist. Many transsexuals conduct romantic relationships exclusively with women. Suppressing or denying the fact of autogynephilia, according to Dr. Bailey, doesn't help anyone, least of all autogynephiles themselves. It prevents us from learning things that would help them perhaps in planning their lives. I mean, we don't really have good follow-up studies on various surgical choices a transgender patient might make.
Get out your biolab kit. It's dissection time. In an absolutist sense, it may be impossible to deny that autogynephilia exists. Rule 34, if nothing else. But to argue that all trans women who are attracted to women are autogynephilic, it would require that you refute all counter evidence that's been published. Ugh, and she's still saying transsexuals here. But again, this shouldn't be surprising me as much as it is. Even though in the author's note, she indicated that she would be respectful of trans adults as much as she could be. Whoopsie doodle, I guess. Yes, some transgender and/or non-binary people have romantic relationships with women. That doesn't make them autogynephiles in anyone's definition who isn't starting from Bailey's typology. Conducting follow-up studies after different procedures or treatments does not require people to identify as or accept the autogynephilia label, especially when the discourse has shifted away from that. And it would be useful to know where and when this Bailey snippet came from, as Shrier herself included some of the longitudinal work with trans people earlier in the book. Blanchard still holds his typology as valid, because an AMAB person who wants to be the wifey in an American dream has a different psychopathology than one who gets off on themselves as a woman. He compares Jazz Jennings with Caitlyn Jenner, saying that there is no way they could be suffering from the exact same condition. Ah yes, Caitlyn Jenner, elected representative of trans and/or NB people everywhere. Blanchard is basically described by Shrier as a gatekeeper for who was deemed appropriate of gender-confirming surgery at CAMH. She reiterates that this was never based on the person's wants. Part of his job was to assess who would likely be able to pass. I shit you not. The criteria wasn't how much it might benefit them, how psychologically prepared they were for it, just how well they would pass. This is described as a good thing, as not passing can be psychologically taxing. Oh, and by the way, to be considered for surgery, patients had to have been living in that gender already for 2 years. Yeah, because prior to the surgical procedures the person may want to have done, and they've been living in that gender for 2 years, it's been just sunshine and rainbows, and their ability to pass doesn't factor into their social interactions at all. Make it make sense, Shrier, because right now it doesn't. Beating a familiar drum, Blanchard continues. He says that trans activists have made it a political issue, which then takes the power away from the medical establishment. This then forces doctors to become salespeople instead of medical professionals.
The erasure of this distinction has arguably enabled and accelerated the opioid crisis, with doctors behaving like vendors, rushing to meet an existing demand rather than evaluating its appropriateness and sometimes frustrating it. You're in pain? Here's some Percocet. You're feeling dysphoric? Here's a script for testosterone. Here's a letter for surgery.
Oh, she hit a metaphorical and literal nerve with that one. Quite the feat, but we'll get to the end of the idea first. Shrier continues that parallel between pain patients and people experiencing gender dysphoria, saying that both rely on self-report. So if a doctor doesn't probe further, they may as well just be handing over their prescription pad. She's a little bit older than me, so she should have some understanding of what drove the opioid crisis. It wasn't really the doctors, and it wasn't the patients, it was Big Pharma. Misrepresenting the safety and addiction potential of the newer pain medication, plus kickbacks, led to doctors overprescribing these medications. The abundance in the community, either from people using their own or acquiring from those who were prescribed but not using, led to a wave of addiction. But getting these medications can become difficult or too costly, so people switch to street drugs like heroin or fentanyl. I will not dispute any of that. The nerve she hit is that I, a chronic pain patient with a fucked up nerve, am now experiencing the consequences of the almost predictable overcorrection by the US in response to this. I am in the process of being tapered off the one medication that has helped with the pain with the most manageable side effects because it is an opiate. And I hate saying it, but I would love to find one of these mythical doctors who just prescribes without question because it would save me so much trouble and grief. But as yet, I have not encountered a single doctor like this, and I have seen many doctors in 15 plus years of dealing with this. Similarly, my video comments and DMs are full of stories from trans and or non-binary people telling me their stories of just miles upon miles of medical hoops they've had to jump through in order to be considered for treatment. The wait lists, the dead ends. This make-believe land of doctors who hand out hormones and oxy like candy seems to be just that. Make-believe.
According to Blanchard, the issues surrounding transgender healthcare have become so politicized that the underlying mental health problem has become completely obscured. The gender-critical feminists are using language like misogyny, patriarchy, male domination, he says. And the transgender activists are happy enough to have the argument in this language, because any language is better than talking about mental illness and clinical management of symptoms.
Something that's not clear to me is where these quotes from Blanchard are coming from. If they're from an interview she did with him, if it's from snippets from other places, some combination of the two, that's not clear. For people like Lisa Littman or the gender specialist psychotherapist, Dr. Kaufman, Shrier went into some detail on the nature of their conversation. Either it was at a nice cafe, it was over the phone, whatever, there were details there. For the sexologists, we're just thrown into these quotes with no context. Speaking of Kaufman, Shrier's conversation with her seemed to indicate that other mental health concerns of people seeking treatment with her are not ignored, or, obscured. Enter the gender-critical feminists into the discussion, formally. It seems a little dated, perhaps, to say that the argument between TERFs and activists is only about things like misogyny and the patriarchy. It's certainly gotten into the medical aspects as well, both in the US and abroad. I'll also point out, again, that the different major medical and psychological organizations have published guidelines or standards calling for the demedicalization of a trans and or non-binary identity. Gender dysphoria? Sure, still a medical issue. Someone not experiencing dysphoria but still requesting hormones or other treatments? Let's talk with the appropriate doctors. But being trans and or NB is not a mental illness anymore. Shrier contradicts herself from earlier this chapter.
One interesting feature of Blanchard's typology is that it completely omits the current crop of teenage AFAB youth with no history of gender dysphoria, now the largest group of patients at most clinics in America, Canada, England, and Scandinavia. Autogynephilia is an exclusively AMAB phenomenon. Researchers have never studied or even discovered AFAB people who claim to be turned on by the image of themselves as men. And most of the adolescent AFAB youth currently identifying as transgender had no history of childhood gender dysphoria.
She just keeps hitting the same points from different directions, I swear. We've previously talked about possible explanations for why researchers and clinics weren't really seeing AFAB trans and or non-binary people until fairly recently, so I won't go into the gory detail again here. Briefly, there were historical trans men. It may have been easier for someone AFAB to find a workable space within the cultural gender roles, especially after the 1960s and 70s. Greater awareness of trans and non-binary gender identities may allow for people who previously would have made something work to find a better explanation of their experience. Also, Blanchard's typology was first put to paper in the 80s. That an almost 40-year-old theory doesn't account for how its described population has changed in the interim says something pretty significant, I think, about the outdatedness of the theory. Yes, autogynephilia is exclusively for AMAB people. That was by design. Just because researchers haven't found AFAB people who are turned on by imagining themselves as men or with gentlemanly bits doesn't mean they don't exist, just that they haven't been researched. And finally, Shrier hasn't successfully shown in her included stories from parents that the kids weren't displaying signs of wanting to be the opposite gender, and gender dysphoria is not a requirement for identifying as trans and or non-binary. According to Blanchard, the youth at the center of this book are either 1. Going to be trans no matter what treatment they receive, 2. Grow up to be gay, not trans, or 3. Have borderline personality disorder and have convinced themselves they have gender dysphoria. Holy shit, what? Especially on that last one. You'd think there would be some research attached to such a strong claim, but of course there isn't. Apparently there is no space for gender questioning to result in somebody identifying as cis and just gender nonconforming, or cis and gasp straight. Blanchard argues that historically, people develop gender dysphoria in isolation. Ah yes, the good old days, where if you weren't happy with the compet life laid out for you, you kept your damn mouth shut, and either lived a life of quiet desperation, lived your truth anyways despite what society was telling you, or found some space in between the two and became an eccentric. Bailey's explanation of the modern AFAB trans and or non-binary youth is more complicated.
Dr. Michael Bailey has arrived at the conclusion that the current trans-identifying teenage AFAB youth are not suffering actual gender dysphoria. Their distress rests instead on the false beliefs that they are like transgender people of the past. It's a mistaken identity, he said. Dr. Bailey believes that for these AFAB youth, gender dysphoria is a hysteria, much like multiple personality disorder, another historical example of disturbed AFAB youth convincing themselves they possess an ailment and then manifesting the symptoms.
Oh look, the turfish trans-identified verbiage is back. It's been a while, so if you don't remember, in gender-critical spaces, trans people are commonly referred to as TIFs and TIMs. I'm curious if Shrier is aware of what trans-identified teen shortens into, and if that was intentional or not. Reference 9 is a short blog post from Psychology Today about dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. That is a discussion for another day. But equating a trans and or non-binary identity with DID is sus. Mad sus. I don't understand what this trans people of the past thing is, and how it's a mistaken identity. Maybe modern trans youth identify with trans people of previous generations because they're all trans? Shrier wraps up this section by saying that Bailey and other academic psychologists want to use evidence to drive things, but that's impossible because everything has been made political. I guess we're going to leave all the evidence Shrier brought up in previous chapters out of this, then. I can understand why she wouldn't be talking about the stuff that I've brought to the discussion, but to act like there's been no research on trans and or non-binary people is just dishonest. Shrier's next point of contention is the immutability of gender identity. Reference 10 is the full legal dealie from a case in Florida between a trans student and his school. An independent summary of the case indicates that the student was being unfairly discriminated against by his school by restricting his access to the boys' bathroom. In her reference, she is pointing to the testimony from one developmental and clinical psychologist, who is described in the doc as specializing in helping trans and gender nonconforming youth. The first I can see something resembling this innate or immutable claim is on page 4, with gender identity not being a choice, and it being unethical to try to change someone else's. Also, the psychologist agreed to there being a biological component which would fit innate. Immutability of gender identity comes up explicitly much later in the document, as part of the psychologist's testimony. It's basically in the context of conversion therapy.
Attempts by mental health professionals to help gender dysphoric patients become comfortable in their bodies, therefore, amount to conversion therapy. If gender identity is the sort of thing that will never change, irrespective of the environmental factors at play, then encouraging a child or adolescent to quiet or overcome the feeling would seem foolhardy, cruel, a form of torture.
The vagueness here is troubling. It does essentially describe what Zucker was doing in trying to get patients comfortable with their assigned gender. And as we talked about in the previous video, that does fit the description of conversion therapy. But since Shrier's sort of saying what I've been saying, you know there's another shoe about to drop. Shrier says there is scant evidence for gender identity being immutable, and points to the Ristori and Steensma paper, again, to say that most kids outgrow gender dysphoria. This paper should be getting an MVP from Shrier at this point, as much as she's used it. It was brought up in the therapist chapter when Shrier tried to argue that Zucker's approach was watchful waiting, and again earlier this chapter for the claim that most children outgrow their gender dysphoria. To reiterate what we talked about before with this outgrowing figure, the paper includes data for gender nonconforming children who were seen at various gender clinics. This doesn't mean that all children showing up to the gender clinic were experiencing gender dysphoria. We also can't know how many left treatment at the gender clinic, not because their gender dysphoria cleared up or they were now comfortable identifying as cisgender, transgender, non-binary, gender fluid, whatever their identity may be, but because of other reasons. Maybe they didn't like how treatment was going. Maybe they couldn't afford continuing treatment. Maybe they moved, and so on. It's also noted in the paper that the persistence rates were lower for the Canadian studies, coming from Zucker's clinic than the Netherlands clinic. As much as Shrier wants this to be an empirical nail in the coffin, it's not. Doesn't stop her from continuing on as if it were, though. Shrier contends that activists are going with the immutability angle, as it's then viewed as a protected trait by the US Supreme Court.
There is a good argument that this is a silly litmus test for offering the Equal Protection Clause's shield to those groups facing discrimination. But because immutability has long been a test for those seeking protection, transgender people are sometimes forced to argue that their condition is immutable in order to demonstrate that they merit protection too.
Maybe I'm just being dense, but what is this good argument that this is a silly litmus test? And trans people aren't just arguing that their gender identity is a core part of them and not something to be changed by external forces for legal reasons. There's also medical, psychological, and social reasons for that argument too. There's a reason the sorts of practices Zucker was using in his gender clinic haven't not been called conversion therapy. But we're back to another argument retread.
But what is gender identity? It has no diagnostic marker, no measurable signs, no blood test to confirm it. It is a feeling, an attitude. That does not mean that it does not exist. But it does mean that, like many psychiatric ailments, it poses challenges to diagnosis and treatment. When the prospective treatment is an irreversible surgery, the slippery nature of the condition would seem to justify measured and careful evaluation.
Wow, okay. Going from what she wrote and following the logical thread, gender identity is a psychiatric ailment. She didn't even specify gender dysphoria or, more likely for this book, a transgender and or non-binary identity. Nope, just all gender identities. Yes, this is a pedantic point. No, I don't have a problem with that. But to retread my arguments, as it apparently bears repeating, the different medical and psychological organizations have stopped considering any gender identity as disordered. The psychological problem comes in when somebody's experiencing gender dysphoria. But a person does not have to be experiencing gender dysphoria to identify as transgender and or non-binary. Professionals in the field are applying careful and measured evaluation. Just because there aren't years of play therapy or whatever attached to it, and the outcome isn't what Shrier wants, doesn't mean it's not happening. Slippery my ass. I was going to paraphrase this, but nah.
If a therapist believes he might be able to help a gender dysphoric patient feel better in their body, Dr. Bailey believes he ought to at least be allowed to try. But the current gender-affirmative therapist leaps straight to affirmation. At best, they're keeping these AFAB youth from adjusting to their natal sex, and at worst, they're encouraging them to take these harmful and unnecessary medical steps.
I mean, if a patient is consenting of the treatment being offered, sure. As long as they are fully informed of what they are consenting to, and the greater context of what this therapy is viewed as by other professionals is fully explained. But this gets complicated with minors. It would then be the parents providing consent. And as this book has more than demonstrated, there's a not insignificant number of parents who would probably sign up their kids for conversion therapy if it meant they might not have a trans and or non-binary kid. Hence, all the laws and bans. And there's a little implicit shenanigans with the language choice here. Attaching gender affirmative to therapists would suggest that these are the minority of all therapists. But as we've talked about, the professional guidelines and standards are leaning towards affirmative care. At the very least, watchful waiting. It's also a bit fucked up that Bailey's best case here is that it's keeping these youth from adjusting to their assigned at birth sex. Like, if they just had a little more time with the right therapist, they could get their gender appropriately sorted. Not that they're actually trans and or non-binary, nope, not even an option. And of course, his worst is the irreversible steps. That, in all actuality, has helped many people dealing with gender dysphoria. Shrier notes that Bailey is aware that these sorts of ideas could get him in trouble with the progressive language police, but he won't give in. Okay, so there are 2 more dissidents left in this chapter, and seeing as how long as this is, they're gonna have to wait until next time. Like you. Until next time. Bye.